In a world where trust is a luxury and freedom is a distant memory, Jessie Bauer stands at a crossroads. Wounded yet unbroken, she faces a new challenge, one that will test her strength, her loyalty, and her will to survive. Welcome to Episode 11, A Distant Wound. A distant wound. A lazy afternoon sun filtered through the curtains. Jessie pulled her pants down and sat on the couch, a formality. The nurse knew well enough that her wound had healed into a jagged scar. "It's healing pretty nicely. You won't need me much longer," Daisy confirmed, offering a small smile. It had been nice having her around. Waters had become increasingly silent, tracking every move made by Thomas and avoiding everyone else, including Daisy and Edwards. Daisy, at least, talked about things other than the elective. She brought homemade cookies and cakes to tempt Jessie, who sometimes wished she could be adopted by this woman. Jessie pulled her pants back up and stood. When she finished, both women smiled at each other, unsure of what to say. Their relationship had been professional, but Daisy had treated Jessie as if she were a kitten that needed coddling. Jessie was certain Daisy cared, not just for the premier's sake, but because she genuinely cared for all her patients. Daisy's warmth had surprised Jessie and helped her pull herself up. "Don't overdo it, little girl," Daisy warned with a smile. "Or else it might mean—" "All Bauers are screwed up and masochistic," Jessie interjected, grinning. Daisy pursed her lips at Jessie's words, but let out a good-natured laugh. "Something like that. I'd rather not see you again, young lady. Stay out of trouble." Jessie bit her lip and shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Promise. Left to her own devices, Jessie looked around. Waters' bedroom suite looked the same, yet everything felt different. She'd seen the room in every light, inspected every nook and cranny. But today, it seemed smaller and less grand, almost like a forgotten picture in a yellowing book. She could feel impatience crawling under her skin, making it tingle. Dust gathered on the windowsill. Adrian would have had an asthma attack, she mused, pushing away her automatic concern for the brother no longer at her side. Despite the distance, she could still feel him with her. She didn't have much company other than her friendly and unfriendly ghosts and her jailer. The push and pull that had once united her with Waters was growing duller. He seemed troubled, but she no longer had the patience to pry. He was becoming more sullen, more suspicious of anyone who dared speak too loudly or sneak away too discreetly. Often drunk by evening, he now relied on Jessie to drag him to bed. Their honeymoon phase, if it had ever existed, was long over. What a life, Jessie Bauer playing nanny to the premier of the elective. She almost missed her time in the reserve. Almost. But what she missed more, what she could barely remember, was her freedom. A notion she had to force down her throat, never allowing herself to indulge. She got up and opened the door. As expected, a guard was waiting. The doctor had ordered her to move about again, and Waters had granted her the privilege of using his private training facilities. She grinned when she recognized the guard on duty, Mark. "Ready for another session, kiddo?" he asked. He was the only guard who spoke to her like a human being. He had been there the day she started fencing imaginary opponents with a wooden sword, the only one she was allowed. Without hesitation, he'd offered to help her train with a real sword. Since then, he'd become her instructor. Walking side by side through the mansion, Jessie enjoyed his stories and the gossip from the reserve. She had tried to get him to talk about Waters and Thomas, but that was the one topic he refused to discuss. "Do you think he knows?" Jessie asked. Mark shrugged. "I don't think so, but he knows everything." They walked into the gym. Jessie stopped in her tracks. "I don't want you to get in trouble," she said. Mark laughed heartily. "He's got bigger fish to fry." He handed her the sword he had requisitioned for her. "Let's not dwell on it." It was risky, but Jessie needed this desperately, more than food, more than even love. As soon as she unsheathed her sword, her worries faded. It was just her, and the graceful movements she was trying to master. Nothing else mattered. Their swords clashed and sweat trickled down her forehead. Her eyes focused intently on Mark's sword. "Don't forget your feet," Mark reminded, relentless. "Move your feet." She pushed back with the elegance of a dancer, her sword's tip grazing his shoulder, forcing him to retreat. It was delicious, the thrill she had craved. She was breathless, giddy, moving against her opponent like a self-willed weapon. As they paused to catch their breath and drink water, a feeling of well-being washed over her. For the first time in a long time, she was doing something for herself. Not for Rex, not for Waters, not even for her family. This was for Jessie Bauer. With each session, she felt herself growing stronger, She was regaining a sense of who she truly was. "Again?" she asked, her voice eager. Mark nodded. When they left the facility, both were exhausted, Jessie even limping a bit, but she knew it would pass. "Next week, I'll find someone to join us. You need to learn how to fight more than one person," Mark said. She nodded eagerly. He had been a trainer before the attack, but like most of Waters' men, he had a shady past. She knew better than to pry. Some secrets were all one truly possessed. They lingered outside the door of her bedroom, her cell. "Hey, I wanted to thank you for this. I don't know why you do it, but it's so important to me," she mumbled, trying to convey her gratitude. Mark nodded. "Why? Well, you're a nice kid," he smiled. "Remind me of folks who deserve to know how to fight." He paused, then added lightly, "Besides, whoever trained you before did a lousy job. I hate seeing a job done badly." Their conversation was interrupted by another soldier. "Waters wants to see you in the garden." Jessie nodded, a frown forming on her face. She glanced at Mark, who barely shrugged. Waters' requests for her presence were not unusual, but the location was. He rarely left his office and private rooms, consumed by growing paranoia. The gardens were heavily guarded, but she had never seen him take a stroll there. But even madmen needed air, didn't they? She found him by a small pond, his hands crossed behind his back. He turned only when she was a few steps away. He surveyed her with a quick glance, perhaps still concerned about her wound. "Heard the nurse cleared you for some real action," he began, straight to business. Jessie was used to this, but she had also noticed his concerned glances, his voice wavering slightly. She gazed at his face, bracing herself. "Sort of," she replied. "So, she speaks. And how are you, Jessica?" he asked, his tone oddly casual. She rolled her eyes. She wasn't the one hiding behind silence. Not speaking to him when he was in one of his moods was her form of retaliation. She was glad it had made an impact. His fingers caught a loose tendril of her hair. His voice lacked concern, but there was a glint in his eyes. "I'm feeling better," she said softly. "Just in time for a field trip," he said, his tone unreadable. Jessie stiffened. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, louder this time. "Come on, Jessica, this is getting old. We both know you don't have a say in this," he replied, voice smooth but firm. Jessie's eyes flashed with venom, but she remained still. Her body still buzzed with adrenaline from her workout. She could imagine her fist connecting with his face, herself running away from Philly. But where would she go? No amount of self-worth could make her forget the hard lessons she'd learned. And she had no desire to see the inside of a cell again. He stared past her, lost in thought. She waited, knowing better than to interrupt. When he finally spoke, his tone was almost gentle. "Have you ever visited your grandparents, the Bauers?" Jessie frowned. "No, I haven't." He nodded as if realizing something. "Did your dad ever speak of them?" he asked. She shifted, uncomfortable. Around them, Mark and the other guards averted their faces. It wasn't the place for this conversation. "Sort of," she answered carefully. Waters seemed lost in thought again, likely considering the Bauers. Jessie found it strange. Here was one of the few people in the world who knew her family well, maybe better than she did. What did she truly know about them? She tried to recall her life before Rex. Her dad had mentioned his parents once or twice, had even thought about finding them at one point, but it was all a blur. Why was this coming up now? Waters snapped out of his reverie. "We're going to your uncle's hometown," he announced. "Mine too." Jessie straightened, feeling a surge of defiance. She knew what this meant. She was just a bargaining chip to him. No matter how attractive he looked or how vulnerable or dangerous he was, she wouldn't back down. "You're the one going there. I'm not," she hissed. He barely flinched. "You want me to leave you here to start your little revolution? Do you think I didn't know about your training sessions with Mark?" Jessie's heart pounded. Of course he knew. Damn him. He always knew everything. His control over her was absolute. Fury welled up inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Waters stepped closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, his scent enveloping her. She held his gaze, refusing to show weakness. "Why didn't you stop me?" she demanded. He paused, considering her question. His grip on her shoulder tightened. Jessie bit back a smile as she crossed her arms. Seeing General Waters at a loss for words was a rare sight, but it was only a momentary lapse. He quickly regained his composure. "I need all my soldiers ready for Lakeview. Thanks for your good work, Cadet Waters." he said, dismissing her with a flick of his hand. Jessie lifted her chin defiantly. Now I'm your soldier? Whore one day, prisoner the next. Losing your grip, old man? His eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his tone controlled. Jessica, just because I enjoy your skills in bed doesn't mean I won't get rid of you once you're no longer useful. We're going to Lakeview tomorrow. Now get out. Jessie's face crumpled, but she didn't move. Why did she care for this man? It was only sex. He was right. Nothing more. She glanced at him once more, her anger melting into despair. Waters turned away, unable to bear the sight of her anguish. Jessie moved toward the door, then hesitated. She had felt so strong earlier, and now, with just a few words, he had taken it all away from her. Why did she care what he thought? She shouldn't. She took a deep breath and opened the door. But she wasn't done yet. She turned back, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. She pressed her lips to his, rough and urgent, pulling his collar to her fingers tangling in his hair. He kissed her back just as fiercely, his chest pressing against hers, pinning her against the wall. Her breath was ragged when she finally pulled away. I'm not going, she whispered, slamming the door behind her for emphasis. Waters didn't follow her. He knew she would come around. She always did. But the thought of it, of forcing her compliance, left him feeling sick. He poured himself a drink and stared out the window, thinking of Lakeview, of Thomas, of Jessica. Would she ever point a gun at him? Would she ever pull the trigger? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Jessica was a liability, a Bauer, but she was also under his skin and he couldn't let her go. He downed his drink and poured another. He had decisions to make. Jessica was in his bed when he finally retired for the night. Her long blonde hair was spread around her like a halo. He hesitated at the foot of the bed. Even for him, what he was about to do was cruel. He didn't want to, but he had to. He sat down beside her, his voice softer than he intended when he spoke. I know you don't want to go, but I have no choice, Jessica. Thomas... She cut him off. I get it. You need me to bait Thomas and the others. Don't apologize for it. I'm not stupid. Her tone was bitter. Waters took a deep breath. They won't care, but Thomas would, he said. His hand brushed her forearm, his fingers tracing a small mole. That mole. You know Thomas has the same one? In the same place? Jessica's eyes widened. What are you implying? Waters kept his tone light, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Thomas was my best friend. I knew everything about him. Hell, we even shared girls. Jessica snorted. And your mom, she had an affair with Thomas, he continued, watching her reaction closely. Jessica was silent, processing. Waters searched her face, feeling a pang of guilt. He didn't want to hurt her, but he had to. His voice grew monotone. There's a high chance Thomas is your real father. Too bad DNA testing isn't in anymore. Jessica's gaze didn't waver, but she said nothing. Waters waited, but she didn't speak. She seemed unfazed, almost as if she thrived on chaos. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride and desire. Jessica's voice broke the silence. Clearly, Thomas didn't get the memo. Waters' eyes moved from her lips to her neck, her chest, and he felt a familiar stir. He wanted to slam her against the wall and kiss her until she forgot everything. But instead, he waited. Who cares? She murmured, shifting closer. Her lips brushed his ear, her teeth gently grazing his earlobe. His hand tangled in her hair, pulling her closer. He kissed her, hard, and for a moment there was no war, no secrets, just them. Later, as they lay together, she whispered, Why do you call me Theo? Where did you hear that? She smiled faintly. Heard it from my Samantha? Nobody calls me that anymore, he said quietly, almost to himself. Jessie nestled closer, listening to his heartbeat, and drifted to sleep. For the first time in a long time, she felt almost at peace. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Trilogy of Jessica Bauer. Subscribe now and join the journey.